Good evening. Welcome to the organizational meeting of the Livonia Public Schools Board of Education, July 20th, 2015. Okay. If you're in attendance with us this evening, you can grab an agenda just outside the door on the counter. If you're following along from home and you'd like an agenda, you can go to www.livoniapublicschools.org. Hover over the board tab and drop down to agendas, and you can follow along with us. This evening we are having 3 meetings that will all be back to back to back. I'll explain at the beginning of each one what we're going to be doing for that period of time. This is our organizational meeting. We're going to run through some very perfunctory functions of the board, setting the calendar and other quick functions. This meeting will be about 15 minutes long, if all goes well. Mrs. Bonifield, will you please take the roll?
Mr. Centers?
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Here.
Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Mrs. Laura?
Here.
Mrs. McDonald?
Here.
Mrs. Bonifield is here. President Burton?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is item 2, audience communications. I do not have any blue slips. Are there any members of the audience who would like to approach the board at this time? Seeing none, we'll go on. The next item on our agenda is item 3, adoption of the 2015-2016 bylaws to establish meeting dates and other procedures. May I have a motion, please?
Sorry.
Anyone?
President Burton.
Yes, Mrs. McDonald.
Let me make sure I got the right one. Move that the Board of Education of Livonia Public Schools School District attach the bylaws to establish 2015-16 meeting dates, procedures for calling and posting board meetings, and the authorization to sign contracts and legal documents for the board.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. McDonald, supported by Mrs. Bonifield. Dr. Leopold, would you like to address this item?
Yes, the motion that you have in front of you supports really a resolution that provides a lot of the details in regards to the board to actually do its business every year. And so this particular motion not only sets the regular meeting dates, which you're required to do, but also talks about specific things that you will do both in board policy and in practice that will allow you to do business for the entire year. And so it's outlined in the attached document. It is the same as was passed in previous years, and we'd recommend approval.
Are there any questions or comments by board members? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. McDonald, supported by Mrs. Bonifield. Mrs. Bonifield, will you take the roll, please?
Mrs. McDonald?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Laura?
Yes.
President Burton?
Yes,
Motion carries.
thank you. The next item on our agenda is item 4, designation of the 2015-2016 bank depositories. May I have a motion, please?
President Burton,
Mr. Johnson.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District adopt the attached resolution designating J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, Bank of America, and Fifth Third Bank as depositories of the school district during the 2015-2016 school year.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mr. Centers. Ms. Abby, would you like to address this item?
Yes, this item is, again, one of those perfunctory items that we do every year as required, and this does establish the banks that the school district will use throughout the year, and there are no changes from the prior year in this document.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from board members? Seeing none, Mrs. Bonifield, we have a motion by Mr. Johnson, supported by Mr. Centers. Would you please take the roll?
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Laura?
Yes.
Mrs. McDonald?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield says yes. President Burton?
Yes,
Motion carries.
thank you. The next item on our agenda is item 5, appointment of investment officer. May I have a motion, please?
President Burton?
Mrs. Bonifield?
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District appoint the treasurer as the investment officer in conjunction with the district's investment policy for the 2015-2016 school year.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bonifield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. And Dr. Leopold, would you like to address this item?
Yes, by board policy and by state law, you are required to appoint an investment officer. And really what this person is responsible in doing is taking care of the day-to-day cash functions of the school district. You've approved the bank accounts in which we can put money into. And so separate from that, by law, we have to approve the person that can do transferring of appropriate funds, any investments on behalf of the school district, and also the investment of operating funds, reserves, et cetera. And so the attached resolution will do that. I did think about assigning this jointly to Mr. Archibald, Mrs. Oaklist, and Mrs. Alice, and then I said, nah, they spend too much money. We're going to let Lisa. We're going to let Lisa be
Depends on what's
responsible
on
for
sale.
that. So, what we're doing is recommending that you appoint the treasurer, which of course is Lisa Abbey, per your actions in January, to be the investment officer to be responsible for those activities within the school district.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Bonnefield, supported by Mrs. Jarvis. Mrs. Bonnefield, will you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. Laura?
Yes.
Mrs. McDonald?
Yes.
President Burton?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is item 6, appointment of staff member to be in charge of elections. May I have a motion, please?
President Burton,
Mrs. Laura.
thank you. Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District acknowledge the appointment of the Director of Business Services as the staff member in charge of school elections for the 2015-2016 school year. This appointment is made by the Board Secretary with formal acknowledgement by the Board of Education.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Laura, supported by Mr. Johnson. And Dr. Leopold, would you like to address this?
Yes, the board is required to appoint someone who will be in charge of school elections. We actually don't have any school elections at this point in time for next year, but we do have a perfunctory responsibility with Schoolcraft College that we'll talk about a little bit later tonight, and so that would fall under the auspices of the person that you're naming here, which would be Lisa Abbey. We've identified her position here as the person responsible. Lisa's handled those responsibilities for the district in the past. And as you know, we typically run any elections issued by our attorneys, the true law firm, who are experts across the state of Michigan in regards to elections. And so we would recommend that we follow that procedure again this year.
Are there any questions or comments from the board? Seeing none, we have a motion by Mrs. Laura, supported by Mr. Johnson. Mrs. Bonnefield, will you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Laura?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. McDonald?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Burton?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is item 7, appointment of staff member to be responsible for posting board meeting notices. May I have a motion, please?
Yes. President Burton,
Yes, Mr. Centers.
move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District acknowledge the appointment of the superintendent and as the administrator in charge of posting meeting notices. The appointment is made by the board secretary with formal acknowledgement by the Board of Education.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Laura. And Dr. Leopold, would you like to address this item?
Yes, again, one of the requirements in the board policy is that the board secretary be responsible for posting meetings, and within the board policy, it does outline that those responsibilities can be delegated to staff, and so that's what this particular recommendation does, which, as you all know, the superintendent in this case is Jill Wozniak. For many things that we do in our school district, Jill Wozniak acts as the superintendent, but certainly formally, that's the responsibility of the superintendent. And as you see on several of the motions tonight, instead of using names, we've used the positions, which makes actually a whole lot more sense, and will provide you to be in a position that, knowing that you will have a superintendent in place in name throughout the school year, that person will have this responsibility and the other responsibilities identified in the previous motions.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments from the board? This item, along with many, many others, Jill makes sure that we are right on top of. And Mrs. Wozniak, thank you so much on behalf of the board for the countless items that you make sure are done for Dr. Leopold, for the board, for the cabinet, for the whole district. We appreciate it. We have a motion on the floor on the table by Mr. Centers, supported by Mrs. Laura. Mrs. Bonnefield, will you take the roll, please?
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Laura?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Mrs. McDonald?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Burton?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. We got those done nice and quickly. This is the end of our agenda for our organizational meeting. We will be adjourned for the next 5 minutes until 7 o'clock, at which time we will rejoin you for our regular meeting. We are now adjourned. Thank you.